Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro.
I'm Alicia Garcia Herrero.
And today we will talk about China real estate sector and urban development. We will try to understand why it is key for China's economy and politics, and at the same time, what it means for local communities. This episode is part of Bruegel's focus on global China as seen from Europe, which includes our monthly newsletter, ZhōngHuá Mundus, and the China Horizon project. You will find the links, both of them, in the show notes. I'm happy to host Yunpeng Zhang, an urban geographer who is assistant professor in regional and urban planning at the University College in Dublin. And Yunpeng's research centers around urbanization, land and real estate development, displacements and dispossessions in contemporary China. Hi, Yunpeng.
Hi, Giuseppe, and hello, Alicia. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. And at The Sound of Economics, we've been already mentioning several times about the connection between the real estate sector, financial markets, and China's economic growth. This time, we want to have a closer look at what has been going on and look at the implications both at the macro level as well at the urban scale where things happen. China's property market has been a key driver of the economy ever since the country began opening its markets in the 1980s. Today, the property market is still a major contributor to the economy, which estimates ranging between 17 to 29% of the GDP, depending on the scope of the industries included. Concerns around the sustainability of China's property sectors have been circulating for many years. And recognizing the risk that the property sector's debt posed to the economy, in August 2020, the government required that property developers must meet certain criteria before they can apply for refinancing. That had a devastating impact on Evergrande, which at the time of the crisis, when it began to unfold, was China's second largest property developer. One of the consequences of the property market crisis had been a fall in home prices, the inability for major property developers to repay their sky-high liabilities, which has shaken confidence in the sector and led to falling house prices, sales and constructions, all of which will have a knock-on effect on the economy as a whole. After a year or so of crisis, property developer stocks surged in November 2022, after the news that the central bank and banking regulator issued measures that encouraged banks to help the real estate industry. This is just a short sketch of a much more complex situation, which sees an intricate connection between the finance, growth, urban development, national rhetoric, and much more. I'm very happy to have both of you, Alicia and Yunpeng, to discuss this because you can help us understand what is going on at the systemic level, what is happening and had happened, and then also at the local level, and how this is all connected to the other parts of the Chinese puzzle. And I would like to start with Alicia and ask you if you can help us to navigate first this overall picture of the sector and these complex linkages with the rest of the economy.
Yeah, I'll be very brief because I'm looking forward to hearing Yunpeng, who is really, the expert here. But in my humble capacity, because I'm just an economist, Yunpeng, you know the thing in and out in its reality. But as an economist, here are some figures. So the Chinese real estate sector, and again, remember, I come from Spain, so I know a little bit about, over-bloated real estate sectors. So actually the figures are quite similar. It's been until 2019 on average 1/3 of fixed asset investment, same as Spain, 1/3 of growth, same as Spain. But the good news for China is that China has financed all of this with its own savings. While, Spain, the US, the UK were importing capital to finance this bubble. A similar case to, more similar, I wouldn't say totally similar, but more similar case to China is Japan, which also went through housing bubble. And then, the bubble burst. It was a land and housing because land was held privately. It's a little bit different than China. And it burst because basically the economy was in a slowdown, and they got into this deflationary mode. China's bursting is a little bit because of over leverage. Basically, these developers were humongously leveraged. And then suddenly there was a kind of a regulatory change, which to me it has more than that. It's about this mantra that housing is for living, not for speculation, which we all know about. And this regulatory change, the three red lines, kind of smashed in a way the access of to funding for developers. The other very important thing to realize is that it is households. This is what I call Chinese wonderful households. Why? Because frankly, I would love to have these households. Let me clarify. They have been financing 80% of the funding was coming from these households that had all of these savings on top of them to offer. Basically, the down payment is about 40%. So, they offer a lot of cash of their own, and then mortgages that banks offer to them quite comfortably because they're putting 40% out there. So you see, it looked perfect, yeah? The household had the money, but the households, as rightly so, the minute they saw that some developers were not finalizing their the units they had paid for or even gotten a mortgage for, they would say, wait a minute, I mean, why I'm paying this mortgage? This is the mortgage boycott that we learned about. It's not very large, but it shows, how fragile the system can be. And then developers started defaulting because they couldn't pay their debt issuance as they couldn't sell the houses anymore. So, what I'm trying to say here, and I finish, is that a model that looks perfect, yeah, I mean, it's my own savings. They're not necessarily over borrowing like in the US. All looked very perfect. But the reality is that when a market is bloated, too big to be true, oversupply, especially in third tier cities, at the end of the day, it's like, the king has no clothes, if you see what I mean. Like, it might not be a crisis, but you need to shrink the sector, and that's going to take time. So I leave it there.
So Yunpeng, as a geographer, you've been observing the impact of this phenomena that Alicia is just explaining on the other side of the story, basically from the ground up, from the urban development side and the local scale. So it would be extremely interesting to see how you would describe not from the financial side or the economic, like macroeconomic side, this urban development and bubble, and what actually has been the pattern on the urban scale for the past few decades, and how it connects with this bigger story that we just heard from Alicia.
I like Alicia's term, wonderful households. I must add, though, many of those households don't really have a choice. I believe what Alicia refers to here is the housing pre-sale system. The idea behind this system was to use borrowed money to scale up housing production very quickly. During the early days of China's real estate development, this was important because of capital shortage. And accelerated housing production would also help the Chinese state deal with problems of housing shortage in many Chinese cities. But as we see today, this system has been increasingly exploited by real estate developers to engage in risky and speculative businesses and ultimately to enrich themselves. Although the business strategies of real estate development companies play a big role in sagas like Evergrande's, what we can't overlook is the Chinese state's determination to pursue urbanization. By urbanization, I'm talking about land and real estate development and urban expansion. Urbanization is definitely one of the most significant processes in China in the past 3 decades. If we just look at the figures as of 2020, nearly 2/3 of the Chinese population lived in cities. and the urban built area was about twice as large as the size of Belgium. The question is why, right? Why China urbanizes so fast and at such a scale? And why the Chinese state is so obsessed with urbanization as land and real estate development. To understand all these questions, it is important to take into account some important features and changes in the Chinese political economy system. The first is the physical restructuring and tax reform in the 1990s. The outcome of these reforms is that revenues are centralized, but spending responsibilities are kept decentralized. So local governments, they need to find money to finance local development, to provide for public goods and infrastructures, and also to meet those growth targets. Of course, for elite politicians, if they manage to do so, good economic performances of a locality also means that they are more likely to get promoted to higher positions. Land and real estate development can perfectly meet those different agendas because most revenues and taxes from land sales and real estate development can be retained at the local level. Outside Shanghai, Shenzhen, this kind of big economic powerhouses of China, many local governments in China rely heavily on land revenues for public finance. So there is this very strong incentive for them to enclose more and more land and to sustain the real estate market. So in this sense, local governments in China, they are complicit in the real estate bubble.
But from what you're saying, there is also a certain narrative which overlap between what you describe and the national rhetoric side. For example, this idea of shared prosperity and this connection between an urban future and what's going on in the official discourse. You've been looking at this and observing about this narrative building and of real estate developers at local level. And somehow it will be interesting for the conversation we have usually at the Sound of Economics to understand how such discourse and such narratives, which we usually see at the central government area, trickle down to the local level and those actors, specific actors such as the developers.
The entire urban boom is exploitative and sometimes violent. In China, urban land is owned by the state and rural land is collectively owned. For cities to expand, rural land needs to be converted, and this conversion process is monopolized by the local governments. Low compensation and the use of physical violence are the main causes of popular grievances. Quite surprisingly, though, many residents, they do not oppose land dispossession or these urbanization projects. Some of them even identify with those urbanization projects. An important reason is resettlement. This is what I believe a key difference between rural land dispossession and land grabbing in China as compared to elsewhere. Displaced households can usually buy resettlement apartments at huge discounts. And there are, of course, certain conditions attached to those resettlement apartments. But importantly, rural households can become owners of housing with more rights than their former houses built on collectively owned rural land. And in booming real estate market, the value of those resettlement apartments can also increase significantly. For many residents living in housing in very poor conditions in central locations, especially for those families who basically could not afford to address their housing needs, displacement and resettlement are one of the only ways for them to acquire housing and become homeowners. When I did my fieldwork in Shanghai almost a decade ago, there was this saying among local population, 穷人翻身靠动迁, which roughly translate like displacement and resettlement are the only means for the poor to change their fate. Of course, housing is also a site of exclusion, right? Housing in many Chinese cities has become incredibly unaffordable. And this has become a main societal concern. In many Chinese cities, a marriage and a local 户口, 户口 is this local household registration. In China, it functions similar to a passport, with all these kind of privileges tied with 户口 registration. So in many cities, marriage and a local 户口 have become preconditions for migrants to acquire housing. And so to use Alicia's terms again here, many wonderful households have to borrow substantially and to pool their resources from the entire extended family to buy apartment. According to a survey carried out by Southwestern University of Finance and Economics, the bottom 20% of urban families by household income, their mortgage debts were 100 times the size of their household income. So the official narrative, housing is for living, not for speculation, can definitely resonate with those families. But whether these, official dream can actually be materialized is an entirely different story.
Thank you. And another aspect which we should touch there, and you touched it already a little bit, is the relation with this local governance. And what the real estate sector tells us about the relation between the big developers and the local government. You mentioned before, and you specifically have done field work in Shanghai. Can there be some examples to be brought in terms of this relation, which sometimes it's also overlooked in international analysis about the roles that the local governments play, especially in relation to growth strategies and how they link up with the central government?
I'm glad that you asked this question. This is something that I frequently discuss with my colleagues here in Belgium. I think within political circles and observers of China in Europe, there is this dominant, but perhaps a little bit distorted image of the Chinese state being very coherent and monolithic. But if we look closely at urban development in China, we can see that there are many tensions and conflicts between state units along different lines. In terms of real estate development, and the interest between the central government and local governments may differ, and sometimes quite drastically, as I would say. Local governments may be more interested in collecting land revenues, but the central government may be concerned more with social and economic stability. The Chinese central government frequently adjusts policies and tightens regulatory control to bring local governments in line with its goals. In the domain of land management, for instance, to protect farmland and to impose a growth limit, local governments are required to replace farmland lost to urban expansion. And this is controlled through a hierarchical land use planning system with the help of satellites. So this means that local governments basically, they can't really hide these kind of growth projects that can cause changes of land use patterns. However, local governments can still find many different ways to pursue their own agendas, which often undermine the interests of the central government. One recent example here is the push for feature town development. Feature town is 特色小镇 in Chinese. So these are urbanization projects, but in smaller scales. And the central government aimed to promote industrial and infrastructure upgrading. It also imposed strict limits on real estate development in those proposed feature town projects. However, what happened is that many local governments still turned feature town development into real estate development projects under many different kinds of disguises. In addition to the conflicts and differences between central and local governments, there are many tensions and conflicts on the local level as well. I recently investigated a mega urbanization project in Yangzhou. Yangzhou is a city which is about 300 kilometers away from Shanghai. This mega urbanization project is part of the New Town new city construction boom in the last decade. The project is situated on the eastern side of Yangzhou, occupying about 8.5 square kilometers. The initial idea for this urbanization project was proposed in early 2000. However, at that time, the mayor was more in favor of pushing for urbanization on Yangzhou's western side. A few years later, this mayor was promoted to become the party boss of Yangzhou, and a new mayor was appointed. Instead of following the footsteps of the previous mayor and consolidating urbanization on the western side, the new mayor supported this mega urbanization project on Yangzhou's eastern side. In addition to practical concerns, an important reason was that eastward urban expansion could more easily show her achievement as a mayor of Yangzhou. So elite politicians' different interests and just, in such a drastic way shaped a city's trajectory and people's fate. In another project, my colleague and I found even more complex relationships between local state units. Since Xi Jinping's rise to power, environment protection has become a political priority. In the case of environment damages caused by weak regulatory oversight or by violations of existing regulations, local state agents will now be held accountable for their lifetime. Our research looked at the city of Wuxi, which is very close to Shanghai. And the local land department there wanted land development projects inside the ecological protection zones to accommodate urban development and to boost GDP growth. However, these land projects were repeatedly rejected by these local departments responsible for environment protection because they worried that these land projects might cause pollution. It is true that the Chinese state plays a big role in urbanization and in urban economy in general. If we accept this view, it is then very important for us to reject this very simplistic view of the Chinese state and try to understand how the Chinese state actually works.
Thank you. And I'm looking at Alicia because I think now this is the time to get back the different pieces of the puzzle. I think that Yunpeng gives us a snapshot which is extremely interesting, not just for the subject matter of the real estate development, but for many other things that we try to analyze here. And I would like to get back to you to weave those different pieces together.
I think we've learned quite a few things. First of all, that, this is a complex, when you look at the micro reality of it all, it's complex because beyond what I said about, a very leveraged sector, nice households financing, there's of course also the issue that do you need to be the first country in the world in home ownership? Do you need to do that? Secondly, do you need to basically accumulate more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 homes and at the same time claim, rightly so, but hardly easy given the circumstances, ecological civilization? You see what I mean? Like this, as the Chinese says, maotun. Yeah, it's like contradictions in essence that make the objective, frankly speaking, I feel driven or close to this objective of the housing is for living and speculation. We Europeans have, had our own medicine on this one. Yeah. And I understand that. On the other hand, though, I feel that there should be a clear division of responsibilities. By the way, again, some European countries have tried, because in Spain also home ownership was very high, but there's been this attempt to because this is also about mobility. Yeah. I mean, mobility also related to climate change. Let's face it. This is adapting to climate change will require mobility. People might not be able to live where they have bought their homes, which is all of their savings. It's like you're getting somehow in a hole, if I may say so. And I understand that the central government is trying to move away from this, but at the same time, the local governments live out of land sales. So, I feel like this problem of the real estate sector goes beyond the real estate sector, as you pointed out, is really also about accountability of a model that in a way is coming to an end. I don't want to say full end, but that needs transformation, put it this way. And I think this is, every time we discuss this topic, I have this feeling that you're kind of touching bone, as we say. Yeah, I mean, that this is where you see the contradictions more than any other sector. And that's why it's so crucial, because if China manages to solve this one, I have to say, wow, because it's so convoluted, as you rightly pointed out. And I think we'll see more, probably a lot of innovation as to how to deal with this, and I'm sure, but at the same time, quite some pain. I don't think we can avoid it. And I think this is a message, unfortunately, that I want to give, that this is going to drag down, because at the end of the day, we are an economic think tank. And I have to say, this is going to drag down China's growth for quite some time. But hopefully the outcome of it is a better outcome. I mean, it's kind of, you need to do it. Yeah, you need to stop this bloated sector that is creating all of these other problems you just referred to. And there's no way out. So, I would like to leave it there.
Thank you, Alicia and Yunpeng. We could go on for quite more time on this, and I think that we are going to come back to this, and especially it's very interesting to get into what is actually going on in the provinces, in the cities, and on the territory directly. So we definitely go back to this kind of issues, and I would like just to thank you for being part of our conversation. And I would like to remind everyone that this was part of Bruegel's focus on global China as seen from Europe, which includes as well our monthly newsletter ZhōngHuá Mundus, to which we invite you to subscribe. The link is in the show notes, and our new project China Horizons, which also links in the show notes. As usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website www.bruegel.org. Yunpeng, Alicia, thanks a lot, and thanks to our listeners for following us, and until next time, bye-bye.